Judge tried to humiliate Jasmine Crockett over a cross, but she left him speechless in court. Jasmine Crockett got fined in open court for wearing a gold cross, but when the lead attorney fainted, she stood up, took control, and argued with such clarity that the very judge who penalized her had no choice but to reverse himself. It was just past 9 Nor to Smem when the courtroom in Dallas County settled into a quiet hum. Day 4 of Monroe v. Ashland Correctional wasn't drawing national attention yet, but inside, the benches were full, a mix of local journalists, students from the nearby law school, and retired folks who treated the courthouse like a civic ritual. Notes were being taken. Some whispered, some just waited. Then the back door eased open. People turned without being told to. Jasmine Crockett entered, saying nothing, no statement, no wave, not in any official capacity, just a civilian, an onlooker, or so it seemed. She wore a tailored black blazer and carried a small leather notebook, its corners softened by use. Her movements were quiet but exact. At her neck, a simple gold cross. Not flashy, not ornate, just smooth and time-worn. The kind you wear for memory, not for attention. No one asked about it, but they noticed. She took her seat in the front row behind the plaintiff, crossed her legs neatly. A quick glance at the plaintiff's lawyer. Lauren Gates, no smile, just acknowledgement. Gates gave the same in return before turning back to her paperwork. Minutes later, Judge Raymond Driscoll entered from chambers. His black robe caught on the corner of the bench. Late 50s, a face carved by time and expectation. Known around Dallas for keeping a no-nonsense court paper cups banned. Phones confiscated, side talk cut off immediately. "Be seated," he said, not lifting his eyes. But then he did. A beat passed. "Ma'am," he said, voice tightening. "You in the first row." Jasmine met his gaze. "Steady." "Yes, Your Honor." He gestured toward the necklace. "I'll have to ask you to remove that cross." The room shifted. You could feel it. Gates's pen froze mid-line. The plaintiff, Cecil Monroe, an older black man with salt in his beard, leaned forward, somewhere in the gallery. A phone vibrated in a coat pocket. Outside, people were already sending texts. Something just happened. Jasmine didn't move. "It's personal," she said calmly, "not political." "I understand," said the judge, tone cool. "But my courtroom doesn't allow symbols that may be construed as religious or ideological, especially near the jury." She didn't argue. Her voice didn't rise. "I'm here in a private capacity, Your Honor, but I won't be removing it. It's not there to make a point." Driscoll's jaw locked. "Then you're fined $200 for violating court decorum," he said flatly. "Bailiff, record it." You could hear the shift in the air. No one yelled, but a wave of disbelief moved through the gallery. A whispered wow from the back. A murmur that could have easily grown louder, if not for the silence that followed. Jasmine nodded, jotted something in her notebook, didn't move, didn't leave, didn't flinch. Behind her, Cecil turned to Lauren. "That's her, ain't it?" Lauren nodded, didn't expect her here, though, technically, the hearing continued, but no one in the room missed the shift. Eyes that were locked on the witness list minutes before now kept sliding to the front row. To the woman with the gold cross who didn't raise her voice, but had already shifted the balance. Judge Driscoll shuffled his paperwork. He sounded as neutral as ever, but every few minutes, his eyes flicked back to Jasmine. Not out of curiosity more, like she'd defied something he hadn't voiced, and the challenge hung in the air. Lauren stood to make her opening remarks. Measured, factual, soft southern vowels. She laid it out. Cecil Monroe, Vietnam veteran, wrongfully jailed for 2 weeks in Denton County after a clerical mistake. By the time he walked out, he had cracked ribs, nerve damage, and a limp. Photos followed, documents, sworn affidavits. Jasmine didn't shift, just turned a page, made a note. Then the defense rose. Daniel Sturgis, all Polish, mid-40s. A voice tuned for press conferences and charity galas. Every word carefully shaped to sound like he wasn't trying too hard. He questioned the injuries, dug up old fights, cast doubt on character, implied that the trauma was exaggerated or maybe even imagined. Driscoll let most of it stand. Objection, irrelevant. Lauren offered, sustained. Objection, prejudicial, overruled. It went on. Through it all, Jasmine's pen moved, not doodling, mapping, tracing timelines, legal precedent, like she'd already seen this play out and was reverse engineering it in real time. Sturgis returned to his seat with the smugness of a man who thought he'd cleared the field. Gave a glance toward Jasmine like she wasn't even there. Cecil muttered under his breath. He talking like none of this happened. Lauren didn't respond, but her jaw clenched. Driscoll finally called for a 10-minute recess. The room rose. People filed out. Some journalists headed to call editors. Jasmine remained seated. The bailiff passed. You sticking around? Yes. You paying that fine? I am. Just not today. He nodded once, hesitated, then kept walking. A moment later, Lauren accidentally dropped her folder. Dozens of pages scattered across the floor. Jasmine stood, quietly helped her gather them. You all right? She asked softly. Lauren looked up, surprised. Yeah. Just tired. You're doing better than they want you to believe, Jasmine said, offering the last page. Lauren paused, then asked, You think he would have fined a man for wearing a yarmulke? Jasmine didn't miss a beat. No. She sat again. Across the room. Driscoll saw the exchange. He didn't speak, but his posture tightened. And whatever calm remained in that courtroom, it was thinning. The courtroom doors opened again. People filtered back in, one by one. Shoes soft against the floor. Conversations low. The buzz hadn't died down, it had just gone quiet, like people were holding something in. The kind of quiet that happens right before thunder. Jasmine hadn't moved, still in the front row, still focused, still wearing that necklace. Lauren Gates was already seated again, adjusting papers with steady hands. Across the room, Daniel Sturgis leaned back in his chair, reviewing his notes like he had time to kill. Judge Driscoll hadn't returned yet, but the bailiff stood near the bench, arms crossed, keeping an eye on the room. Then the judge came in. Court will resume, he said flatly, seating himself with a practiced motion. The plaintiff may now take the stand. Mr. Monroe, please. Cecil rose slowly. He adjusted his blazer. His limp noticeable now cut through the room more sharply than any evidence board could. He raised his right hand, took the oath, and sat. The jury leaned in slightly, their pens lifted. Lauren stood. Mr. Monroe, can you walk us through what happened the morning of January 12th? Cecil's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. I was still asleep, he said. Didn't even know what time it was. Heard some shouting, thought it was for someone else. He mimed being yanked upright. But then a guard opened the cell. No warning. Just grabbed me by the shirt and slammed me against the wall. My head hit something. The rail, I think. Lauren nodded gently. Did you resist in any way? I was groggy. Didn't swing, didn't fight. Thought it might have been a drill or something at first. But they cuffed me tight. Too tight. Behind the table. Jasmine watched every word. Her notebook lay open in her lap. But she wasn't writing. Just watching. Lauren's voice thinned slightly, a fraction quieter. And after you were restrained, they tossed me on the floor. I think I blacked out for a second. Woke up with my cheek on the cement. Felt like my ribs were crushed. Lauren flipped a page, then froze. She blinked once, twice, then her knees buckled. There was no sound of warning, just a sudden thud as her hand slipped off the table and her body hit the floor. Call 911. The bailiff rushed over. A woman from the gallery stepped forward, kneeling beside Lauren, checking her pulse with calm precision. Jasmine was already moving, her voice low but clear. She was pale earlier, Jasmine said. Didn't say she was sick. Someone opened the doors. Footsteps echoed. The paramedics arrived within minutes, lifting Lauren onto a gurney and wheeling her out through the aisle. Cecil sat at the witness stand, motionless. The image of his attorney being carried away clung to him like fog. The judge removed his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose. This court is in recess until further notice, he said, almost tired. Counsel for the plaintiff is incapacitated. Proceedings will be rescheduled. But Cecil shook his head. No, Your Honor, we can't afford to wait. His voice was hoarse, almost trembling, but he wasn't begging. I don't got money for a new lawyer. This was it for me. If she can't do it, he paused, searching the room. His eyes landed on Jasmine. You can. Right? You're a lawyer. The room stilled. Every pair of eyes turned to her. Jasmine didn't answer right away. Her expression didn't change. I'm not involved in this case, she said. I was here to observe. Cecil leaned forward, urgency rising. But you've been sitting here, taking notes, listening. You know what's happening. Please. Driscoll studied her closely. Are you licensed in Texas? Ms. Crockett, I am. And are you willing to step in on record as counsel for the plaintiff? She looked at Cecil, then at the judge. I'd need time to review the file. "You have 10 minutes, Driscoll said dryly. "No more." Gasps swept the gallery. Whispers followed. No one had expected that, not from the plaintiff, and certainly not from the bench. Jasmine stood, calm as ever, and walked to the plaintiff's table. She opened Lauren's folder, didn't ask for help, didn't waste a second. She read. Her hands moved fast. Pages turning, notes jotted, sticky tabs placed. She wasn't reacting, she was processing. This was a woman who had built her career on being prepared for rooms that didn't want her in them. She wasn't auditioning. She was stepping in like she'd always been standing there. Across the aisle, Sturgis leaned back, arms folded. His expression was skeptical, a smirk barely hidden. He wasn't worried, not yet. To him, it was a procedural delay, an interesting footnote, a dramatic twist that would collapse under pressure, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She circled 3 pages, highlighted timestamps, reviewed a medical log, and whispered something to Cecil. "I didn't mean to pull you into trouble," he said, eyes lowered. "You didn't." She replied, "This case matters. That's all. You think we got a shot?" She met his eyes, steady. "I don't take cases I don't believe in. You told the truth. Now it's my job to make sure that truth gets heard." The bailiff returned to the center of the room. Court is now back in session. Driscoll adjusted his glasses. "Ms. Crockett, you are now officially representing the plaintiff." "Yes, Your Honor." "Understood. You may proceed." Jasmine rose. No notes in hand, just her in the room. The jury sat up straighter. She spoke plainly. "My client, Mr. Monroe, isn't asking for a favor. He's asking this court to apply the law, to recognize that what happened to him wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a violation." She turned toward the jury box. "He was detained by mistake. That's already a failure. But what happened inside that facility wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, it was excessive, and it was preventable." Sturgis stood abruptly. Objection argumentative. Driscoll didn't flinch. "She's within her opening," he said. Eyebrow raised, overruled. Sturgis sat. The smirk faded. Jasmine didn't stop. She moved to the projection screen, clicked a button. A document appeared. Cecil's intake and release record. A big red stamp, hold lifted, release approved. January 11th. "That's the day before he was assaulted," she said. Next slide, medical reports. Fractured ribs, radial nerve damage, bruising across the jaw. The force used against him wasn't just unjustified, it happened at a time when he was legally cleared to walk free. The courtroom was locked in. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Jasmine clicked through images. Surveillance timestamps, officer logs, small things, little notes in red ink. But she wove them together with precision. This wasn't about drama, it was about order, about showing how a system, piece by piece, can be exposed with nothing more than calm, unshakable clarity. She kept going. Jasmine walked back to the table, reached into Lauren's case folder, and pulled out a laminated card standard issue from Ashland Correctional. It was labeled in bold inmate handling use of force protocol. She held it up for the jury. "This section," she said, tapping the middle with her finger, "clearly states that force may only be used as a last resort, and only when there is an immediate threat to safety." Then she looked back at the jury. "My client is 67 years old. He has degenerative joint disease. He walks with a limp. He was asleep when they entered his cell. There was no threat." She paused. No threat, and yet there was force. One of the jurors shifted in his seat. Another leaned slightly forward. The courtroom was quiet in the kind of way that feels louder than noise. Sturgis was writing something down now, but his movements were sharper, more reactive. Jasmine continued. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. She just kept her focus locked on the jury and let the evidence speak with her. "This isn't about assumptions," she said. "This is about impact." She stepped to the screen again and clicked to the next slide, a still frame from a security camera inside the cell block. Guards entering Monroe's cell nearly an hour before their recorded shift time. She drew a line in the air with her finger, motioning to the time code. "These are the details that matter. These are the pieces that create a pattern." She returned to the table and laid down the laminated card gently, then looked directly at Judge Driscoll. "We're not here to make headlines," she said. "We're here because the law must apply even when the victim isn't powerful, even when the damage isn't caught on camera, even when the system hopes we stop asking questions." Then she sat, silence again. No coughs, no creaks, just the sound of the ceiling vent humming faintly above. Driscoll cleared his throat. "Defense may proceed." Sturgis stood. He walked toward the jury with the calm polish of a man who had spent years learning how to sound reasonable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dipped in sugar. This case isn't about injustice. It's about perception, about memory, about what people believe happened, not what can be proven. He clicked to a photo on the monitor. It showed Cecil Monroe exiting the prison hallway during his release. No wheelchair, no blood, no visible injuries. This is what we see, Sturgis said. A man walking out on his own 2 feet. The records show a medical check before release. He didn't mention an assault. No complaint was filed that day. He turned back to the jury. Pain is real. I don't deny that. But pain is also subjective, and stories can shift with time. He let the words hang in the air. Cecil sat stiffly at the witness stand, his hands curled slightly on his knees. Jasmine put a hand on his forearm beneath the table. Not to comfort, just to steady. Sturgis continued. You'll hear from a witness, he said, a fellow inmate who claims he saw the incident. But that man, Jerome King, is currently serving time for perjury. He stepped back. Ask yourselves, how reliable is a man in prison for lying under oath? He let it sit, then returned to his table. Driscoll turned toward Jasmine. Cross-examination, she stood. Permission to proceed, she said. Granted. She walked to the screen and tapped it once. The hallway photo disappeared. In its place, the same intake and release form she'd shown before. You said Mr. Monroe left without visible injuries, she said, glancing at Sturgis. He nodded. Correct. She zoomed in on a section of the form. This says he was discharged after a nurse's examination. What time was that check conducted? Sturgis hesitated. Approximately 14 hours after the incident. So, there was a window, Jasmine said, turning to the jury. 14 hours with no documentation, no photographs, and no medical records. A window long enough for swelling to set in, long enough for injuries to be masked. Objection speculative, Sturgis said. Overruled, Driscoll replied, his voice flat. Jasmine continued. We're not talking about a scraped knee. These are broken ribs, nerve damage, facial trauma. These aren't invisible injuries. These are injuries that matter. She walked toward the jury box again. Let's address Jerome King. She held up a document, his court record from 5 years ago. Yes, he was convicted of perjury, in a property dispute, but what wasn't mentioned? She clicked again. A log appeared. Is that Mr. King came forward voluntarily. No reward, no incentive, no plea bargain. Just a handwritten statement delivered through official prison channels. She looked at the jury again. Why would someone risk their credibility to lie in favor of a stranger? Why would a man who knows his name will be questioned stand up and say, I saw it, unless he truly had? A juror tilted her head. Thoughtfully, Jasmine stepped back to the screen. Another image appeared, the unit floor plan. Jerome King's bunk, she said, pointing to one end. Monroe's cell, she added, tapping another. They face each other directly. No obstructing wall, no angle issues. Mr. King's statement includes specific details, guard entry times, how many officers, what Monroe was wearing, details that match the internal logs. She returned to the table and picked up one more piece of paper. This, she said, raising it carefully, is the facility's internal report. It was not shared with the Monroe family. It was not included in the discovery packet, but it exists. She handed copies to the clerk, who distributed them. It confirms an incident occurred, names redacted. But the timestamp lines up exactly with the morning of January 12th. Sturgis leaned forward sharply, eyes narrowed. Jasmine didn't look at him. She turned back to the judge. You can redact a name, she said, but you can't redact a pattern. She stepped back. Cecil whispered, You're shredding him. Jasmine didn't smile. It's not about him, she said softly. It's about you. And she wasn't done, because what came next wasn't about law or evidence. It was about what had happened that very morning, and how symbols, no matter how small, can rattle a system more than any shouting ever could. By the time the court resumed after the afternoon break, the atmosphere felt different, heavier, focused. The jury wasn't just listening anymore. They were watching her, closely. The jurors were sharper now, eyes tracking every movement, posture more alert than it had been all day. Jasmine hadn't touched her notebook since returning from recess. It sat on the table, closed, as if she didn't need it anymore. The folder in front of her was untouched. Her hands were still, but there was something gathering beneath the surface. Judge Driscoll settled in, his elbows pressed slightly harder against the bench. He gave a glance toward the defense table, then turned to Jasmine. You may proceed, Ms. Crockett. She stood. This time, she didn't walk to the screen, didn't approach the witness stand. She remained exactly where she was, upright, grounded, a quiet stillness around her. "Before we move forward," she said, her voice even but firm, "I need to address something that took place earlier today, not as argument, not as distraction, but as context." The courtroom hushed. You could hear the creak of a bench, a breath drawn and held. She reached up, slowly, and touched the small gold cross that rested just above her collarbone. It caught the light not bright, but enough to mark its presence. The gesture wasn't theatrical. It was deliberate. "This necklace belonged to my grandmother," she said. "Elsie Redmond, born in 1930, Ruston, Louisiana. She couldn't vote until she was nearly 40. She looked straight ahead. She believed in faith and in law. She taught me they were not enemies. They were tools, each one sacred when used with honesty." She let that sit. "This morning, I was fined $200 in this courtroom for wearing this cross, because someone believed it might interfere with objectivity." Her hand dropped slowly. "But if a necklace threatens the foundation of justice, maybe it's not the symbol that's the problem. Maybe it's what the symbol reminds us of." A shift moved through the gallery. Not noise, just energy. The kind of presence that builds when people know something true is being spoken in a place where truth is usually buried in procedure. "I didn't come here to make a statement," she said, "but I won't ignore the one that's already been made." Now she walked to the screen. A new slide appeared, Hope v. Pelzer, 2002. In this case, she said, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a prison guard who shackled an inmate to a hitching post in the sun violated the Eighth Amendment. She paused. There were no bones broken, but it was cruel, and cruelty is enough. She clicked again. Another case, Hudson v. McMillian, 1992. In that case, the injuries were minor, but the court still found it unconstitutional, because brutality doesn't require broken ribs. It only requires intent. Judge Driscoll leaned back slightly, hands clasped. Jasmine turned back to the jury. "What happened to my client isn't just unfortunate. It isn't just a bad mistake. It is unconstitutional. And the law at its best was designed to recognize that." She turned off the screen. The room stayed still. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the judge cleared his throat, almost reluctantly. "Defense may respond." Sturgis stood. His confidence had dimmed, just a little, but it was still there. He straightened his tie, walked toward the jury again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, tone softer now, "you've heard passionate argument. You've seen documentation. You've heard about pain." He tapped the table lightly. "But law is not about passion. It is about facts. And the facts show that Mr. Monroe walked out on his own, that there's no video of the alleged incident, that the medical report, though delayed, confirmed he was cleared." He let that hang, then added with quiet gravity, "Sometimes memory and meaning overpower truth." Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't need to, because she wasn't done. She stood again. No notes, no screen, just her voice. "You said there's no video," she said. "That's true. What we have are records, medical reports, witness accounts, logbooks, photos. You said law isn't about passion, it's about fact." She took a step forward. "I agree." She turned to the jury. "But here's another fact. If there had been video, if there had been a camera in that cell, the defense wouldn't be saying it didn't happen. They'd be saying he deserved it. They'd be pointing at body language, tone, pre-existing injuries. They'd find a way to explain it away." One juror exhaled quietly through her nose. Another uncrossed his arms. Jasmine took another breath. "That's why we have standards. That's why we have the Constitution. Because sometimes evidence is incomplete, and the only thing left to rely on is whether the pattern fits." She walked back to the table, placed both hands gently on the surface. "Mr. Monroe was supposed to be released on January 11th. Her voice stayed low. "He was assaulted on January 12th. She held up the release document again. "This says, hold lifted. And yet, he was still in custody, still in a cell, still in pain." She turned again to Judge Driscoll. "You've asked us to be precise. We have been. You've asked us not to rely on emotion. We haven't. But at some point, we have to ask, is the absence of video more important than the presence of truth?" She sat down. No one clapped, no one moved, but something had shifted. Even Sturgis, as he returned to his seat, had nothing to say. Cecil leaned toward Jasmine, his voice a whisper barely audible. "She'd be proud of you." Jasmine didn't reply, but her hand touched the cross, just for a second. Across the gallery, Reporters were already scribbling furiously. One of them mouthed to another. She flipped it. She really flipped it. But the case wasn't over. There was still testimony to hear, still questions to ask. But in that moment on that afternoon, something had changed. The jury wasn't just analyzing. They were believing. And for the first time since Cecil Monroe filed his lawsuit, the weight had begun to shift. Not because of yelling, not because of outrage, but because one woman, sitting quietly in the front row, had waited for her moment and spoken when it mattered most. The next witness was brought in quietly. No press notice, no chains. Just a short, compact man in his late 40s with a shaved head and calm, watchful eyes. Jerome King. The moment he stepped through the side door, the jury sat forward slightly. And not because of who he was, but because of how still he was. He didn't look like someone trying to convince anyone. He looked like someone who had already said what he needed to say, and would simply say it again. "Raise your right hand," the bailiff instructed. He did. Seated in the box, King kept his gaze low. Jasmine stood. "Mr. King, are you currently incarcerated?" "Yes, ma'am. And what are you serving time for?" "Perjury, 5 years ago." She nodded. No reaction, no judgment. "You submitted a statement voluntarily in this case. No deals were offered, no reduction in sentence." Why, King shrugged slightly, like the answer was obvious. "Because I saw what happened." She let the silence sit. "You were housed directly across from Mr. Monroe's cell." "Yeah." "Bunk 6. He was in 11. "Could you see into his cell clearly?" "From where I was every time the door opened." "Yeah." Jasmine approached the diagram on the screen. "This is the layout you remember." King scanned it. "Looks right." She circled the key angles in red. "Describe what you witnessed on the morning of January 12th. King inhaled slowly, eyes focused on some distant image only he could see. "They came early, I remember, because breakfast hadn't come yet, and that's rare. I saw 2 COs walk into 11. No radio, no clipboard, just went straight in." He paused. "I saw Monroe's feet come out first, like he got dragged. Then I heard a bang, then nothing." "Did you hear him speak?" "No. He didn't yell. That's what stuck with me. He didn't even fight." Jasmine nodded slowly. "And did you tell anyone?" He looked at her. "They don't really ask inmates to volunteer info, especially when it's about COs. But you did?" "Yeah. Because it was wrong." "That's it." She nodded again, stepping back. No further questions. Sturgis rose. His tone was lighter, more casual, like a conversation over lunch. "Mr. King, you mentioned you're serving time for perjury." "Yes." "You lied under oath once before." "Yes." "So, how do we know you're telling the truth now?" King didn't blink. "You don't?" There was a slight rustle in the gallery, an uncomfortable chuckle from someone in the back. King continued. "All I can do is say what I saw. You can believe it, or not." Sturgis tried another angle. "You were in for a property dispute, correct?" "Yeah." "Trying to claim land that wasn't yours." "No. I lied to help my sister. She didn't know I changed the name." Sturgis turned to the jury with a slight shrug, as if to say, "You see." He returned to his table. Jasmine didn't need to stand. She didn't need to rebut. The jury had already heard what they needed. Next came the final exhibit. She stood once again and walked to the center of the room. This time, she held up a photocopied report, one that hadn't been entered into the record until that very morning. "This is an internal log from Ashland Correctional," she said. "It was obtained through a last-minute subpoena after the plaintiff's counsel fell ill. It confirms that an incident occurred in the early hours of January 12th. The names are redacted, but the time matches. The location matches." She walked over to the evidence table and laid it down gently. "The defense has not disputed the timing. They have not refuted the injury. Their only argument is that it can't be fully proven because the system that inflicted the harm didn't record it." She paused. "Maybe that's the pattern we should be questioning." She turned back to the jury. "This isn't about whether Mr. Monroe walked out on his own. It's about why he limped for weeks afterward. It's about why the medical check didn't happen until hours later. It's about a chain of silence and the people who are always asked to prove more than they're given credit for surviving." She stepped back to her table. The judge looked down at the bench, then at the time. "We'll move to closing arguments," he said. Sturgis stood, straightened his tie, and adjusted his voice to something gentler. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case has taken many turns. It began with a simple claim, and it became something else. It became a symbol. He gestured slightly toward Jasmine, not with aggression, but implication. But we're not here to make statements about symbols. We're here to apply the law. He walked slowly past the jury box. And under the law, claims must be supported, injury must be clear, intent must be proven. That's the standard we are all bound by. He let the words linger like a verdict. Ask yourselves, has that burden truly been met? He returned to his table. Jasmine stood last. No dramatic pause. No theatrical gesture. Just her voice, centered. My client came to this court seeking accountability. Not fame, not vengeance, just the truth. She moved slowly as she spoke. Cecil Monroe was wrongfully detained. That's on paper. That's not a theory. While he was in custody, he was assaulted. That's supported by medical reports, a sworn witness, and the facility's own internal logs. She turned. But even if none of that existed, there is something else here. Something you've seen and heard for yourselves. She looked to the jury box. He didn't lie. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't even yell. He just told you what happened. Plain, clear, and when the system tried to bury that under procedure, the facts still rose. She stepped back. The question isn't whether we have perfect proof. The question is whether we have enough. Then she sat. The judge looked out over the courtroom. This court is adjourned until the verdict is reached. Jury will remain seated. The bailiff opened the door. People began to rise. But Judge Driscoll looked over once more. Ms. Crockett, he said. A word, please. She paused. She didn't move toward the door. She turned, walked slowly back toward the bench. The courtroom emptied behind her, but the room didn't feel any less full. She stood near the clerk's desk. The judge leaned down, voice low enough that only she could hear. I reviewed the fine I issued this morning. She waited. I was wrong. She said nothing. It wasn't about the cross, he added. It was about control. I didn't expect a challenge, especially not from someone sitting in the gallery. Jasmine tilted her head slightly. A silent reply. He sighed. I've struck it from the record. You won't see it on the ledger. Thank you, she said. He looked at her, almost hesitant. You were the most prepared lawyer in this courtroom today. Jasmine didn't smile, but her eyes held something. I didn't come here to prove anything, she said. I know, Driscoll replied. That's why it worked. As she turned to leave, he asked one more question. That necklace? How long have you worn it? Jasmine paused. Since I passed the bar, she said. But really? Longer than that? Driscoll nodded once. Don't stop. And just like that, she walked out. No applause, no fanfare, just the quiet sound of heels against the floor, heading back into the world outside. Outside the courthouse, the sun had shifted. White-hot light reflected off the stone columns and blazed across the courthouse steps. Reporters had already begun to gather again, forming a loose half-circle near the doors. They didn't expect her to come out alone, but she did. No staff, no publicist, no security detail trailing behind. Just Jasmine Crockett, walking calmly, a notebook tucked under one arm, the same gold cross resting above her collarbone visible, unbothered, and untouched. The microphones moved first. A wall of them rushed forward as soon as she hit the first step. Congresswoman Crockett, did you expect to win the case today? Will you be taking more civil rights clients? Was the judge's fine really about the necklace, or was it about who you are? She raised one hand, not to silence them, just to center the moment. I came here in a personal capacity, she said. I plan to sit, listen. Nothing more. But you ended up arguing the case why a voice called out. She looked toward the crowd, because someone needed help. And the law gives us the right to step forward when it matters most. Another reporter shouted. Did Judge Driscoll apologize for the fine? There was a pause. Then she smiled just slightly. We had a respectful conversation, she said. And let's just say, a fine was issued, and later withdrawn. That could have been the end. But she didn't leave it there. I think sometimes people confuse authority with correctness, she said. But being in charge doesn't make you right. Being willing to change your mind that's leadership. That line didn't just land, it stuck. By the time she reached the sidewalk, 3 outlets had already clipped it. Another typed the quote live into a headline. She didn't break pace. Someone tried to keep up with her, thrusting a recording device toward her shoulder. She didn't retreat. She didn't speed up. She just kept walking. 2 blocks down, with the camera still pivoting behind her, she turned quietly into a small bookstore tucked between a pharmacy and an old cafe. No press followed. No one noticed her go in. She left 10 minutes later with one book in hand, a used copy of Gideon's Trumpet. The cashier, a college student, stared at her. "Are you—" "The woman from the courthouse." Jasmine smiled. "I'm just someone who loves the Constitution." Back inside the newsroom, editors scrambled. The case was already being packaged for primetime broadcast. Some ran with the flashiest version, Congresswoman saves civil rights case after courtroom twist. Others got a little clever gold cross, silver tongue. The day Crockett took the courtroom. But one headline came closer to the truth. Crockett doesn't wear power. She wields it. Still, even the media didn't quite capture what mattered most. Because what happened in that courtroom didn't just go viral. It echoed. In a Phoenix high school, a civics teacher played the courtroom clip in her 11th grade class the next morning. Most students were half asleep when the bell rang. But halfway through the video, one student who'd never raised his hand all year spoke up. "Wait," he said, "can judges really do that? In Kansas?" An older man retired, a Vietnam vet like Cecil, posted the clip with a caption that read, "We fought for this." She reminded them why. In Milwaukee, a pastor showed the video to his Bible study group. "This," he said, voice quiet, "this is what it looks like to walk into fire and still speak with grace." It wasn't just about the cross. It wasn't even just about the win. It was about the way she held the room, how she sat, how she moved, how she never raised her voice but still managed to change the current of the courtroom without forcing it. A shift had occurred, not just inside that building, but out in the spaces where people had spent too long being dismissed, underestimated, told to wait, to soften their tone, to change how they looked, to try again later. People who'd been fined for wearing the wrong thing. People who'd been shut down for speaking too early, too honestly, too loud. People who'd been told you don't look like a lawyer. They saw her, and they saw themselves in her. Cecil Monroe gave one interview. It was quiet, shot from the porch of his daughter's house. He held a copy of the verdict papers in his hand, the sun warming his shoulder. "She didn't even know me," he said, "but she knew this system. And she didn't let it walk all over me, just 'cause it could." Lauren Gates recovered quickly. She sent Jasmine a private thank you note. Then, in a second message, she offered to co-counsel on another pending civil rights case. As for Jasmine, she returned to Congress the following Monday. Back to committee hearings, back to long floor votes, back to quiet battles and long silences in rooms where the same old power plays on loop. She didn't make a speech. She didn't post a viral thread. She didn't even mention it on the record. But the necklace, it stayed. Every session, every panel, every hallway walk where a camera might catch it, briefly glinting in the corner of a frame. One journalist caught up with her in a corridor, between meetings. "Has the cross become a symbol?" Now he asked. "Of defiance?" She paused, turned to him. "No," she said. "It's not defiance." Then she touched it lightly. "It's memory." She let the word sit. "My grandmother wore it when they said she couldn't learn. My mother wore it when they said she couldn't vote. I wear it because they said I didn't belong in certain rooms." She smiled, and then I walked in anyway. That quote landed on the front page of 3 national papers the next morning. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. It carried weight. It reached the ones who needed it most. The single mother defending herself in court. The student doubting their place in law school. The man who had stopped trying to speak up because he thought no one would listen. It reminded them all, law isn't about who yells loudest. It's about who speaks when it matters. And sometimes, power doesn't come crashing in through the front doors. Sometimes, it just walks in silently, sits in the front row, and waits.